And on we go to Chapter 6. Chapter 6 closely examines the experiences of African Americans in the United States. It's important to examine their experience closely as it is different from that of any other group in the United States. Because African Americans arrived involuntarily, their experience has been different from the beginning. They did not arrive as colonists or as immigrants. They also differ from Native Americans and Mexican Americans in that they were not here before the arrival of the Europeans. The demand for labor in the southern plantations led to the long period of black slavery. Various forms of resistance such as the Underground Railroad surfaced over the years with some success, but slavery became such a vital part of the southern economy that no resistance could come close to making any impact. The impact of slavery on slaves, as we know, was great, yet there are varying opinions on how slaves responded to their situation. While some scholars claim that the conditions the slaves endured created a culture of submissive and passive slaves, others argue that there was a network of support among the group that gave them a high degree of resiliency. While Fogel and Engerman claim in their book, Time on the Cross, that slaves developed a wide range of skills, a richer culture, and strong family networks during the period of slavery, Fogel later wrote in his book, Without Consent or Contract, that slavery was a devastating experience where the dominance of the slave owners denied them any kind of political or economic opportunities and basically reduced them to the status of property. Although African Americans did arrive on our shores as a subordinate group, their status as slaves was permanent. Thus, they don't fit the true mold of immigrant, since most immigrants eventually integrated into the mainstream society, as discussed in our earlier chapters. They really don't fit the definition of a colonized minority either, since they were not conquered in their own land, but taken and subordinated elsewhere. In April of 1861, the Civil War began largely over the issue of slavery. On January 1st, 1863, the Emancipation Proclamation brought freedom to slaves in the United States, and areas still in rebellion were ordered to comply. The armed forces of the U.S. were authorized to enlist free slaves. This, however, didn't mean that they would be treated equally. After the Civil War, efforts were made to assist the free slave via the Freedmen's Bureau. The 13th Amendment was ratified and slavery was abolished. 1886 saw the ratification of the 14th Amendment, which provided protection and a number of guarantees to former slaves, such as due process and equal protection. The rights given to former slaves under the 4 Reconstruction bills served to raise the level of resentment against the new freedmen. The white planter class openly claimed that the new rules were a deliberate effort to destroy the Southern way of life. As the Southern whites began to see their position of dominance seriously threatened, organized attempts to keep blacks in their position began to surface. The Ku Klux Klan was the worst example as their tactics became increasingly violent. As resistance to white supremacy diminished, federal troops withdrew and whites continued their efforts to reassert their dominance. Sharecropping surfaced as a means of agricultural production and reduced both blacks and whites to poverty. Agricultural production resumed, but sharecroppers were caught in a cycle that kept them poor and in debt. The advent of Jim Crow laws brought about a system of legal segregation that lasted for nearly 100 years. Jim Crow laws required separate facilities for blacks, segregating schools and every public facility, including even cemeteries. Eventually, every aspect of their lives was ruled by segregation imposed by the Jim Crow laws. Efforts to deny blacks the right to vote took various forms. The 15th Amendment protected the right of blacks to vote. Literacy tests, required property ownership, poll taxes were effective in reducing the number of blacks who voted. Some states made it impossible for blacks to be nominated for office. Other ploys, such as the grandfather clause, allowed only those whose grandfathers were able to vote in 1860 to vote. This made it impossible for most blacks to vote. In 1896, the Plessy versus Ferguson decision upheld separate but equal laws in Louisiana. Justice Harlan's prediction of how the decision would cause racial segregation, as well as the accompanying racial hatred to spread, came true. By 1920, racial segregation in the South was the norm, and blacks were segregated from whites in every aspect of daily life. As the economy evolved, it became easier for blacks to move to the North and leave the South. This was a bit of an issue for the Southerners who relied on them as a source of cheap labor. The onset of World War I changed the flow of immigration from Europe and halted the flow of cheap labor to the North, opening the door for blacks to work in the war industry and move into an urban setting. Although they were needed as a source of cheap labor, they found prejudice and discrimination in the North as well. At this point, the experience of black Americans began to resemble that of recent immigrants, since they moved north willingly. Throughout the difficult economic times that followed World War I, migration of blacks north and west was slowed but not stopped. It wasn't until World War II that more vigorous migration of blacks to the north and to the industrialized southern cities resumed. After the Plessy versus Ferguson decision, blacks began to lose many of the guarantees they had gained after the Civil War. White supremacist groups became more violent, and blacks began to feel that fighting was pointless. African American leaders began to accept the idea that equality wasn't going to happen anytime soon. Booker T. Washington's Atlanta Compromise speech told the whites that blacks were ready to accept their inequality and that blacks were not ready for equality yet. 1905 saw some resistance to Booker T. Washington's ideas as the Niagara movement formed under W.E.B. Du Bois, who felt that blacks should assert themselves and defend their rights. The Niagara movement later merged with a group of white liberals to form the NAACP. In the meantime, the violence continued with lynchings, cross-burnings, and open attacks against blacks and their property and businesses. Writers and artists such as Langston Hughes, Zora Neale Hurston, and Claude McKay used their work to elevate black pride and create solidarity. Some separatist efforts emerged here and there, most notably the UNIA under the less than effective leadership of Marcus Garvey. His idea was to take blacks back to Africa. This movement met with some resistance and was squelched as Garvey was deported to Jamaica. The Lost Nation of Islam, or the Black Muslim group, later surfaced promoting religion, race pride, and self-help. This group also had the establishment of a separate nation within the U.S. on their agenda. Discrimination in the war production industry and within the armed forces also became an issue, making it appear that the discrimination was actually national policy since federal funding was involved. Franklin D. Roosevelt's Executive Order number 8802 put an end to the discrimination present in the war industry as well as in the armed forces. This era also saw a rise in nonviolent protest. The formation of CORE came as a result of concern over rising tensions among black citizens. The feeling was that they had endured too much discrimination and frustrations were rising to a point where violence seemed inevitable. Their focus was on nonviolent action that would push the agenda of black Americans. The idea was to get the public's attention and then to demonstrate peacefully for action. Colonialism began to decline after World War II, when the disparate treatment of military personnel became an issue. President Truman took action to end segregation in the armed forces in order to avoid a proposed march on Washington, D.C. Victories also came in the courts. The Brown versus Topeka Board of Education decision in 1954 was a major coup in effectively throwing out the separate but equal policies allowed by the Plessy decision of 1896. Segregated schools were declared a violation of the equal protection guaranteed by the 14th Amendment and unconstitutional.